Welcome to the Be the Change podcast with your host, Ralph Harper. On this podcast, he shares his vision for the future of the United States. Think of this podcast as somewhat of a roadmap to times in the future on a continuum from a dark past to the 2060s. Yep, that's right. He's a forward thinker whose purpose is to dictate positive outcomes for our children and our country versus leaving it all to chance. Ralph will cover parenting, fatherhood, accountability, and what it takes to win in this great nation. It's not just Ralph. He will have difficult conversations with other thought leaders of different backgrounds and political affiliations. It's time to get started. Here's your host, Ralph Harper.
Good morning and welcome to Be the Change. Several years ago, a family was visiting the White House and the father requested some time with President Obama. And he was granted that time. He and his son, his family went in to meet the president, and his son, a young boy named Jacob, was there with him. And Jacob was so excited about being in the White House and meeting the first Black American president that he actually asked the president if he would lean over so that he could touch his hair. Jacob wanted to feel his hair to just validate and know that this man, who was the most powerful man in the world, was like him. He wanted to feel his hair and just check to see if it felt the way his hair did. And the president accommodated him. He leaned over, and I still have that vivid image of the president leaning over and Jacob reaching upward to touch his hair, just to validate and confirm that this black man, the president of the United States of America, although he looked like him, Jacob needed further assurance that he was like him, and he wanted to touch his hair. So Jacob proved for everybody else in the country that the president of the United States was actually a Black American man like him. It's very compelling to just see that image. And I tell that story because I actually had a chance to meet the President of the United States as well, President Barack Obama. And I've told the story before. I met him once while he was a candidate visiting Dallas. But I also met him again in the White House. And when I met him in the White House, I actually sat in a meeting with him, and I had a chance to sit at the table with him. I was literally probably about 3 or 4 seats away from where he sat. And we sat in a meeting for over an hour. I didn't ask to touch his hair or anything the way Jacob did, but my experience was, I guess, somewhat similar, because when the president greeted me, but right before we started the meeting, he grabbed my hand and we locked fists. We both took our respective left hand, and we patted each other on the back, which is just a common thing that Black American men do. And for me, that was my validation that, wow, this is a Black American president of the United States. And again, it was just one of those powerful things, just to be in the presence of a president of the United States. And especially special for me because, yeah, I'm a little bit biased, and I just appreciated and respected the fact that, wow, our country is so amazing that, 69 million people voted to have a black man be president of this great nation, the most powerful country in the world. And so I want to talk about the presidency today because I have to tell you, I'm concerned, and I'm a grown man. And quite honestly, I admit to you today, I'm scared. I'm scared for our country. And that's just the reality. That's just real, and I'm going to tell the truth about that. My message today is not biased in any way in terms of my political views. I will admit I have voted as a Democrat for several years, and there's a good chance I will vote as a Democrat in the upcoming election. But that doesn't mean that I have any disdain or any prejudices for Republicans. I just don't. I really don't. And I have friends who are Republicans, and we talk. We have debates. We have open discussions. And I recall President Obama saying once, he says, it's okay to disagree. And I'm paraphrasing, but he talked about the notion of being disagreeable. And I kind of got the impression that he was suggesting, well, to be disagreeable is just nonsensical. But it's okay to disagree. So I've had conversations with people who are Republican and who may have views that are counter to my views and my values. And I respect that, and we can move on. But there are, and this whole notion of just that dynamic, Republicans versus Democrats, is so, it's so unfortunate sometimes to watch the way it pans out. But it's real. I've actually had some friends who were very disappointed with me because I made a conscious decision to read President Bush's book, President George W. Bush's book, Decision Points. I read that book because I wanted to know certain things about the president. And his book was easy to read because it was outlined in chapters that talked about certain decisions he made. I was curious about Katrina and how he handled that particular situation. But as I read further along in the book, and I got near the end of the book, there was one chapter. It was titled the Lazarus Effect. And in that chapter, President Bush talked about how he worked very closely with Condoleezza Rice, and they were able to get all these funds approved to provide financial aid to different countries on the continent of Africa for the purpose of eradicating AIDS. And because of his action and because of his decision to work with Condoleezza Rice on that particular thing, AIDS has been managed so well and almost eradicated in Africa, in the entire continent of Africa. And that was because of a decision that President Bush made. I think of other Republicans, and I think about John McCain. I still have that image of John McCain stopping the woman and saying, no, candidate Obama is not she called him a Muslim. John McCain made a conscious decision to stop that conversation and make it clear that candidate Obama was a decent family man. I think I'm quoting him. He said he's a decent family man who just happens to have different views than I have. And again, there was two men, a Republican actually supporting a Democrat, one of his most fierce competitor in that race. But John McCain stood up because that's just where his heart is, and that's where his heart was, and I have so much respect for him. And I wanted to put that into context because as I go on and I have this conversation today about the presidency and the power of the presidency and the power of the president, and I tell you, this is something that's very important because I think sometimes people miss it. They don't really understand that level of authority. And one of the reasons I can say to you today that I'm concerned is because of that fact. The fact that I have come to realize the power of the person sitting in that Oval Office. And it is profound, and it is very scary, and it's scary for a lot of reasons. And I want to talk about some of that today. This past weekend, I was having a conversation with an old friend. He's an older man, and his name is Tom Johnson. He's the father of my absolute best friend in the world, Fern Johnson. And Dr. J, I call him Dr. J, Dr. Johnson. And we were talking, and I was visiting with him and visiting with his wife, and there was just the three of us. We were just talking. Usually it's just Dr. J and I, and we talk and we sit around and we solve the world's problems in a single hour. And we've done that several times, but during this conversation, Dr. J came up with a quote that he was clearly intrigued by, and he wanted me to know what that quote was. So he went to his phone and he found it, and he came back and he read it to me. He said, "This is something Martin Luther King once said." He said, "There's nothing more dangerous in the world than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." I found that really interesting, and I want to put that into context, because from my standpoint, what it means to have sincere ignorance is, I get the impression that that's something like saying people who are legitimately ignorant. And that could be because as a child they didn't read enough and they just don't have the smarts, but it's legitimate. It just happened, and it may have been because of their circumstances, but you can always point back to some reason why that person may be in that predicament, where they are just not at that intellectual place where they could have been had they comported themselves differently growing up from childhood and into adolescence and into adulthood. On the other hand, the notion of being conscientious and stupid, that's something else, because that clearly says that you know better and you're still willing to make really bad choices or do stupid things. You're conscientious and you know right from wrong, and you make very conscious decisions to do things that you know are wrong or stupid. And I want to talk about that today, because I said earlier that I'm concerned. I even said, as a grown man, I'm scared. And I think it's important for me to put into context the basis for my fear. We live in the absolute most powerful country in the world. Our country is free enough where anyone can become president. Almost anyone can become president of the United States. Our forefathers had the wherewithal to realize that the average citizen of the United States can become president. So they included checks and balances. They etched that requirement into our documents and our Constitution, because they wanted to have an out if something happened where someone who might not be stable ends up in the White House, someone who might be making bad choices or choices that might ultimately have negative impacts on the country overall and the citizens of the country, and potentially, our allies around the world. And they put that in place, and they did that for a reason, and here we are. President Obama wasn't a perfect president. But as I watched him and as I witnessed him comport himself in that role, I felt comfortable that he was at least doing his best to protect and serve the United States of America. He at least gave me that comfort level that he was at least minimally trying to do what he really believed in his heart was right. And while I'm not pitting the two together, I'd be remiss not to point out the fact that from the beginning of President Trump's campaign, President Trump has made me, as a citizen of the United States of America, he has made me uncomfortable. He has caused me to question his values. He has actually caused me to question his integrity. He has also caused me to question and really think about his will. What is he willing to do? I quite honestly think that every citizen of the United States of America should be thinking about that particular question. What is the President of the United States of America, President Donald J. Trump, willing to do? I ask that question for a legitimate reason. And this is not just something I pulled out of a hat. We can sit back and pretend all day long that every single thing that our president has been involved in or accused of being involved in, and in some cases proven to be involved in, is just fake news. We can continue to do that, and certain factions of people in our country are willing to do that, including some of the people in our United States Congress. They're willing to sit back idly and pretend that all of the accusations that have come up and all of the things that have happened in terms of people being indicted, people being convicted, people pleading guilty, and so on. Everybody's in some cases seem to be sitting back and pretending that this is all just fake news and some conspiracy going on, or whatever the case may be. I suggest that is not necessarily the case. There's something serious going on. I want to make these points because some of the things that we are experiencing today could impact our country for years and years to come, related to a number of things. And we have to be aware of that, because at some point there will have to be a correction to resolve some of the things that are happening as I speak, that could impact our country for many years to come. President Trump's presidency started with a questionable election. There's still a lingering question about whether or not the Russians played a role in electing him. And I say that there's a lingering question because there has not at this point been anything definitive that has proven things out. And we know that we're still waiting on reports from Mueller and the FBI and so on. And there's just certain things that have not just been completely closed. The circle has not been completed yet. When you think about the regulations that have changed, a lot of what President Barack Obama did, they have reversed, including very serious concerns related to climate change and other things that are important to the rest of the world and to most people in the United States. The President of the United States, President Trump, has put all of those things on hold. And it's a question of, well, what will the impact of that be? Think about the hurricane that hit Puerto Rico. It was quite honestly sad just to watch our country ignore our citizens of that small island. It's just sad to watch what happened there. We neglected them, and we are still, to this day, neglecting them. I cannot imagine Puerto Rico would be in the shape it's in if there was a different president. Not necessarily just President Barack Obama, but I imagine any other president would have handled Puerto Rico quite differently. And think about the fact that our president has actually been accused of interfering with our justice process. He fired Comey. There are several other things that he's being investigated for potentially. Think of all the people around him that have been indicted, and all those things have not been resolved at this point. But you can think also just about the international relationships that have been torn down for the last 2 years since the president has been in office. Our primary allies around the country. It seems our allies around the country view the president as unstable, and they quite honestly have some legitimate reasons to think that way. If you think about some of the things that are happening in our country, it's proven our president is willing to stand up in front of millions of people and fabricate things and tell outright lies. There's questions about his business dealings in terms of the emolument law, where he's conducting business while in office. He has stated publicly that he fell in love with Kim Jong-un, the president of North Korea. Our president seems infatuated with other leaders around the world who major countries, other countries around the world view as dictators. Our president is hell-bent on building a wall to separate the United States from Mexico. I could go on and on and on with this list, but I'd like to bring this full circle just to bring Michael Cohen into the equation. I think that what Michael Cohen has made a conscious decision to do is telling. And there's a lot more that will come from Michael Cohen, I believe, that will paint a picture that can be validated of who the president really is. And these are the things that concern me. These are the things that really concern me in terms of our country. Because if Michael Cohen is right, then we are in a very scary situation. And I say that because of something that Michael Cohen said while he was being ripped apart in that session with Congress and answering these really tough questions. He took a moment to literally point out some of the representatives who were in that room, and he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he suggested, some of you guys, if you continue to ignore the president and what he's doing, you will find yourself in the same place that I'm in. Michael Cohen was suggesting to some of those Republicans who continue to support the president with his comportment, they may find themselves complicit in the president's actions and what he's doing. And again, we have absolutely no idea everything the president is doing. We know the things that Michael Cohen talked about, but we have no idea what's happening behind the scenes. And as I mentioned earlier, this has to do with a question of the president's will. What is he willing to do? And I can tell you just from my personal experience that when you're backed against the wall, something like that, being in a predicament like that, will dictate your will, your willingness to do certain things to protect yourself or to get out of a particular situation. And my concern again is that our president is backed against the wall. And he's not just backed against the wall by someone who is just a random citizen in the United States or some mafia guy or someone like that. He may be compromised by the Russians. And we know that if he is, it could be very serious. It could be that he owes money. It could be they have provocative pictures or whatever the case may be. I have absolutely no idea, but it just seems that something is going on that is causing our president to be way too friendly with President Putin. I don't know the complete answer I really don't. But it's a fair question to ask. Is the President of the United States of America compromised? And compromised in a way where either his life could be in jeopardy, or his children's lives could be in jeopardy, or something like that, because it comes back to the will of the president to do whatever it takes to make sure that his family and that he is safe. And that could mean putting the United States in jeopardy in a very serious way. I stated earlier the fact that the role of the President of the United States is very powerful. The President has access to our nuclear codes. He has access to every ounce of very sensitive data that we hold near and dear to our hearts. He has access to our secrets, our technologies, things that should never ever be made public to the world or any other foreign leader who might be perceived a foe of the United States, which Russia happens to be. And when you think about that, and you think about the fact, you kind of conflate the two, and you realize that, wow, our president has had these very private meetings where he's not willing to tell the American people what he discussed with Vladimir Putin. He's had at least 2 or 3 of these meetings in private settings where he's come out and refused to let us know what he discussed. But more important than that is the fact that it came out recently that it's possible that our president has spoken with the president of Russia, Putin, over 100 times on the phone. And it's a question of, well, what's going on in those conversations? Why is it so important to speak to the leader of a country who has always been a foe to the United States? What is so important that they're talking about on the phone 100 times? And why aren't they willing to let the American people know the content of those conversations? It becomes a question of whether or not Donald Trump is sharing sensitive information with the Russians in order to get out of whatever mess he may have gotten himself into with them. And again, I say that because this is the primary thing that makes me fearful of our current president and his presidency. Because if he is willing to do something like that, we have to think about the profound impact of that for years to come. Imagine if Putin is collecting very sensitive data that he otherwise would not have access to if President Trump wasn't in office. Imagine the will of President Putin to leverage that information against the United States. I'm not, and I've said this before on my podcast, that I'm not sure if it's possible that President Trump has total access to our nuclear codes, and can he give that type of information to President Putin? I'm not sure about that, but I can tell you one thing. Excuse me, even the notion scares the hell out of me. And it's not just our nuclear codes, it's other sensitive and secret data that our president may be sharing with our biggest foe in the entire world. And I can tell you that I'm not the only person who's fearful of this and bringing it to our attention. I can imagine that some of our allies around the country are concerned as well. They are probably scared as well. This is something we have to think about. And I think we'd be remiss. And I think that when I think of Congress and the way that they're kind of sitting on their hands and they've been unwilling to play the role they should be playing in terms of checking and balancing things out with our president and the presidency, there could be some very serious consequences of that. And we just have to see things we just have to wait and see how things pan out. But if I'm right, and I pray to God that I'm not, this could have long-lasting effects on the United States in ways that are today unimaginable. We have no idea what some of the outcomes of this could be, but it could be pretty significant. And for as long as we are willing to sit on our hands and not do anything, and to allow this president to be out of control the way he seems to be, putting our country at risk. And it could be a serious thing going forward. And I'm telling you that it matters. Whatever it is that the president, or whatever it is that Putin has on the president, could potentially drive his will to do whatever it takes, regardless of what the impact might be to everyday citizens of the United States and the United States in general. Whatever it takes, he's willing to do that to get out of this mess that he has created for himself. And that is a very unfortunate predicament to be in. Unfortunately, we find ourselves in this place where we're vulnerable. The only thing we can do is sit and wait. And as we wait, we have absolutely no idea what's happening behind the scenes. So we wait. We don't have all the answers. We don't know. It really does feel like, and when you consider all of the things that are happening around the president, and when you just look at his comportment just in general, just the way he behaves on a daily basis, it's easy to assume something is going on. And the longer we are required to wait, the more danger we may find ourselves in as a country and as people of the United States. So for now, all we can do is wait. It feels very vulnerable being in a predicament like this, where the reality is all we can do is wait. And to use one of our president's favorite phrases, we'll see what happens. But in the meantime, I am compelled to remind you once again, there is nothing more dangerous in the world than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. Thank you so much for listening. Be blessed and have a wonderful week.
Thank you for joining us on Be the Change. Be sure to subscribe today and don't forget to rate and review so we can continue to bring you the best conversations. Visit ralphharper.com for show notes, resources, and events. To support Be the Change, please join our patron community at patreon.com/Ralph Harper. Be the Change returns the same time next week and is brought to you by the 2060s Project.